The shoreline of the 5 Great Lakes, together with their connecting rivers and channels, is over 8,300 miles in length. That shoreline encompasses 1/2 of all the fresh water in the world. Although 1/3 of the residents in the United States live and work in the areas immediately bordering these waterways, no single city is more totally related to this natural gift than the stacker of wheat, the player with the nation's railroads, the Seaport of Chicago.
Wheel amidship.
Wheel amidship, follow.
Engine's half astern.
Half astern, follow.
Stop engine. Go the starboard anchor, 1 shot in the water.
There goes starboard. 1 in the water.
Ask a Chicagoan where the great seaports of the land are, and he'll probably say New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, or San Francisco. But this city's very growth, like other great cities of the world, fed originally upon water transportation. It is the only metropolitan city in the world which stands upon a continental watershed. Even the immense railroad complex, so long associated with Chicago, began with a line whose sole purpose was to serve as an adjunct of our fantastic inland waterway system. In fact, Chicago's first locomotive arrived here aboard the deck of a schooner. Here are the rivers and channels first plied by the flatboats and broadhorns, later by the keelboats with 80-ton cargo capacities. And this is the very river whose flow east to Lake Michigan was reversed by man's agency in 1900, when they cut through the few feet of earth which had once formed a parting of the continental waters, a topographical phenomenon known as the Chicago Divide. Thus was formed the original Chicago Drainage Canal. Stay with this route long enough, and you will reach New Orleans via the Mississippi. As men began to attack the great deposits of ore, coal, and other minerals along the waterway shores, as the vast forests of Canada and grain fields of the Midwest produced monumental tonnages requiring low-cost transportation, Chicago grew into prominence as a Great Lakes port. Our location at the extreme end of the lakes and at the very beginning of America's inland waterways system was an advantage shared by no other city in the world. But in the entire hustling history of this town, even that wasn't enough. When a schooner left here in 1851 with a cargo of grain for Liverpool, England, it traversed an early system of locks in the St. Lawrence River, which circumvented both the rapids and falls and gave Chicago's planners a new dream, one they never really gave up after that: the dream of becoming a major seaport for ocean-going vessels. But railroads, the children spawned by the limitations of our waterways, put that dream to rest. In their adolescence and adulthood, they kept their rates low and provided overland transportation good enough to hold back development of a Chicago seaport for the next 80 years. So, historic Old Navy Pier, which was to have been only one of many such municipal piers, carried the full load of our Great Lakes package freight and passenger shipping. Then the dream came alive again. Upon the death of the city's last harbor master, William Lynch, in 1953, the mayor elevated the old port agency from bureau status to the level of an executive department of city government. The seaway was in the wind once more, and when it became a reality, Chicago was one of the first to be ready. Captain John J. Manley, director of the Department of the Port of Chicago.
In the not-too-distant future, the present locks, the present St. Lawrence Seaway, as we know it now, will very definitely be dated. Canada is taking steps now to build bigger and better locks. The cooperation of the United States will be forthcoming, so that here in this great seaport, the dreams of those planners, Chicago planners, Chicago people who had great dreams and visions of making this perhaps one of the world's great inland seaports, taking our place with Rotterdam, Marseille, Yokohama, Liverpool, London, Sydney, Australia, and all the other ports of the far-flung corners of the globe.
The port itself has two main entities, north and south, with a giant complex of private industry-owned terminals strung along the shore between them. To the north, Navy Pier, the place Chicagoans visit to get a whiff of salt sea and of general cargo. The mayor's foresight in 1957 began preparing the pier for the deep hulls of the world's maritime trade routes. To the south, Calumet Harbor, steel, bulk, and grain storage country. On June 30th, 1966, in a scene viewed only by chance passers-by but celebrated by state and city officials, the Chicago Board of Trade, the Association of Commerce, and the Mississippi Valley Association, a dredge lifted a token bucketful of mud and slime from the Calumet River channel linking Lake Michigan with Calumet Harbor. And at this moment, Chicago truly became a deep-water seaport. The waterway was completed to a depth of 27 feet and a width of 200. It marked the last time a fully loaded ocean-going vessel would have to partially unload before entering one of the most fantastic man-made harbors in the United States. You enter this kaleidoscope of sights and smells 6.5 miles to the east, where the Calumet River meets Lake Michigan. All along the way, the ships and barges load and unload the raw materials and finished goods that nourish and sustain, that feed blast furnaces and stomachs, that generate power, that build and store, that create the wealth and economy of a Chicagoland unmatched anywhere in the world for per capita income. This is a world of rust and ore, of salt and chemicals, of exotics in bulk before they're packaged, of Chicago-made machines on their way to anywhere. This is a world of movement, and none of us remains untouched, either directly or indirectly, by the revenues generated along the veins of this artery. This is a part of the city unseen by most Chicagoans, but whose language is the language of all the countries of the world, and whose music is the common beat of men and ships whose purpose in life is the intercourse of industry. Maxi Cohen, manager of the Regional Port District.
This vessel is owned by an Italian group, is under charter to a Norwegian family that reside in Glasgow, Scotland, and flies the Panamanian flag. And nothing that I can think of portrays our development as a deepwater port or is more significant than this vessel, which epitomizes 4 different nationalities involved in one transaction. I think we ought to go aboard it, and from it we can look at the harbor. It's hard to believe that a little over 10 years ago, everything that you see here was nothing but swamp, a little bit of mud, and garbage. In the creation of this artificial harbor, not one dime of the taxpayers' money has been used. There's about $35 million worth of private money invested in these particular facilities. So you are looking today at the only harbor entity of its kind on the Great Lakes that is completely independent of public, that is, public financing. Everything has been done through private resources. If you look over to the left here, just about 6.5 miles, is Lake Michigan and the route to the ocean. Over to the right, and in that particular direction, is our connection with the inland waterway. So that what you're actually viewing here is what we hope will be the new Rotterdam of America. Just behind us are 2 of the finest grain elevators on the North American continent. One of them, incidentally, is leased and operated by the Illinois Grain Company, which is the largest co-op in the state of Illinois. The other facility is operated by the Continental Grain Company, one of the largest international grain merchants. And from this you can begin to see the significance that agriculture plays in this particular harbor.
LaSalle Street, Chicago's canyon of financial and insurance firms, and the heart pump of the port's vascular system. Rising at its head in a monolithic tribute to grain is the Board of Trade. Second only to the New York Stock Exchange in market size, it handled $66 billion in sales last year. Between 9:30 a.m. and 1:15 in the afternoon, the destinies of the free world's fertile acres will be determined for another day. By law and tradition, all transactions must take place by auction and by public outcry. And while these men are mere landlocked souls, their cacophony at the ringing of the morning bell will follow an historical pattern established in 1848, buying and selling agricultural commodities, many of which enter Chicago's giant maw and leave for the world's markets by water.
Now the grain that comes in here comes from the whole Midwest. The trucks that come in here sometimes come as far as 500 miles. We have grain that comes in by barge, and there are many barges in this harbor every day. And with the development in about 18 months and the windup of the Cal-Sag, we expect to have tows of 12 to 15,000 tons of grain moving into this market from points as far away as Kansas City. Starting now, We are going to come into the big leagues because we have deep water, and there isn't any question in my mind that these facilities and the others on the Calumet River will, in the next 5 to 7 years, double the output of grain that is moving out of the Great Lakes. Last year we handled about 100 million bushels, and I think that by the early 1970s, with deep water, we should double this. And when we do, then we'll really begin to come into our own, not only as the great grain market, but as the greatest grain shipping port on the Great Lakes.
It's more than possible most Chicagoans cannot even picture the huge tonnages involved in grain shipment from this port. They would be surprised indeed to learn that when the familiar paper boats have finished unloading their miles of newsprint, they too go south to an elevator, fill up with grain, and return home. Even ore ships, monsters up to 730 feet in length, unload in steel territory, are washed down, and fill their holds with the products of the field. Again, Maxi Cohen.
Now, the harbor itself is a very, very complex aggregation of facilities that have been laid out with the idea of catering to every type of business, because we're proud of the fact that while we handle the largest cargo of locomotives, incidentally, that ever moved out of the United States on one cargo, that the place has to be geared up to handle everything proverbially from a hairpin to an elephant.
And elephants they were, giant steel elephants. It took more than the entire month of June 1966 to load the Norwegian freighter Kristen Smith with 43 diesel locomotives. Made in LaGrange, Illinois, they were picked up by the doughty little vessel's monstrous boom crane and lowered gently into what is considered to be the largest continuous hold in any merchant ship on the 7 seas. Fitted like pieces of a puzzle below and above deck, the locomotives were destined for the island of Formosa to become the bulwark of nationalist China's railway system. This was the most valuable single-vessel cargo ever to leave our port, in excess of $6 million, and a far cry from Chicago's first schooner-delivered Iron Horse.
And when you look over at the other side and see this tremendous storage of foreign cars, you want to remember that almost all of the English cars and French cars and other foreign cars come in here and are distributed through the Port of Chicago. Over on the other side, in line with keeping a diversified harbor and bringing into Chicago all of the facility that is necessary for a great harbor, is the only tank farm that is available to deep water. There's 177 acres over there with almost $9 million developed, and through it move vast quantities of lard, grease, and tallow that come from Iowa, Dakota, Minnesota, and places like that, and are shipped out of here, most of it to the northern tier of countries in Europe and in the Mediterranean. Alongside this dock right now, as I mentioned before, you have 4 vessels which represent international trade. This one, of course, is used in what we call the North Atlantic Run. She stops at France and picks up steel and automobiles, and then she goes into England. The one behind is operated by the North German Line, and her run is usually from Hamburg, Bremen, Antwerp, and Rotterdam. The one behind that is significant because it's a German ship operated by a Dutch organization, and her primary trade is from Rotterdam. The vessel behind it, of course, epitomizes our growing relationship with the Far Eastern Bloc, and of course it represents one of the Yugoslavian vessels. It's the only vessel that you will see in here with the sickle and hammer. She engages in the cargo business in and around the Mediterranean and in the northern tier of African states. Here's a practical instance of foreign trade where you see a Yugoslavian ship that loaded these huge iron and steel girders at Genoa. These These two heavy pieces, each weigh about 85 tons, were fabricated in Italy, and they're consigned for a bridge job. So here you see longshoremen working, handling Italian cargo from a Yugoslavian ship, and the use of the heavy floating crane, which belongs to the port district and which is incidentally the largest and heaviest piece of equipment of its type on the lakes.
While those with dreams in both industry and local government have worked to make the Seaport of Chicago a reality, it remained for yet a few men to take giant steps in the face of opposition to help complete that reality. The circle of history had closed. Now the railroads could either help or hinder the evolution of a giant new port once more. When prohibitive rate structures threatened to dampen industry's enthusiasm, those men acted. One of them was Ben Heineman, president of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad.
Some years ago, when the Seaway was first contemplated, it seemed to us at the Northwestern that the railroads had a real stake in the Port of Chicago. We were very anxious that the Port of Chicago assume what we thought was its rightful place as one of the preeminent seaports of the world. But we knew that in order for this to happen, and regardless of opposition or objections, the seaport had to have the assistance of the railroads that both gather and distribute tonnages. We thought that one of the ways in which we could give real assistance was by reducing rates for export tonnages so as to give the Port of Chicago the volume that it needed, and to put all of our facilities at the disposition of the port for both gathering tonnage to be exported and for distributing tonnages to be imported.
Thomas Jefferson was credited in 1803 with the statement that it would take 1,000 years for that portion of the United States west of the Mississippi River to be completely settled. What Mr. Jefferson overlooked was something men of the sea have always known. It's a basic rule of commerce that ships will follow cargo. And until the chilly descendants of the glaciers that first made Chicago's topography what it is, until those yearly ice flows make us all landlubbers for another winter, they will follow cargo to Chicago. Then Alicante, Antwerp, Bangkok, Basra, Belfast, Bilbao, Bordeaux, Bremen, Calcutta, Copenhagen, Dakar, Haifa, Helsinki, Hong Kong, Lisbon, Liverpool, Maracaibo, Melbourne, Nagoya, Naples, Oslo, Busan, Saigon, Singapore, Taiwan, Yokohama,